Welcome back to Slabbed Portfolios, the podcast where we break down the biggest comics, collectibles, and action figures so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. Please make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss any updates. Today we're talking about something that sounds simple, on the surface at least, but in practice is one of the hardest parts of collecting comics. Selling. Not buying, not grading, not even finding good deals. Selling. Because selling comics isn't just a financial decision, it's an emotional one, a timing decision, and honestly, a psychology test all wrapped into one. And over the years, I've noticed that most of the regret in this hobby doesn't come from what people buy. It comes from how and why you sell, and other times what they didn't buy, but that will be for another episode at a later point in time. So today I want to break down 3 rules for selling comics that, if you actually follow them, will save you a lot of frustration and probably a lot of money too. And the first rule is the most important one, and it's the one most collectors get wrong right away. Rule number 1 is simple. Be sure you actually want to sell the book. Not a need to sell, not a force to sell, not a, I guess I should sell because I need the money right now situation. We don't want to be in those situations at all, and actually want to sell the book. Because I've seen this pattern over and over again in collecting communities. A collector hits a rough financial patch or something comes up in life, and the first instinct is to start liquidating comics. And on paper, it makes sense. Comics are assets. They have a value. They can be turned into cash. We all know that. But emotionally, that is one of the worst reasons to sell collectibles ever. Because when you sell under pressure, you are almost never making a clean decision. You're making a reactive one. And what tends to happen after that is regret. It's not always immediate, but later on, when the pressure is gone and you realize what you let go, it'll come. And here's the key detail most people miss. Even if the sale goes well financially, even if you get a fair price, the emotional outcome is still often negative because you didn't really choose to exit the book. You were pushed out of it. And that's why I always say, if you're going to sell a comic, you should be able to say this clearly to yourself. I want to sell this book. I no longer need it. I no longer want to have it. I'm choosing to move on from it. And you should be able to say that with 0 reservations. That shift matters more than people think, because once you remove the urgency from the equation, you start making decisions that actually align with your collection, not your situation in the moment. And this is where a lot of long-term collectors separate themselves from short-term sellers. The best collectors are very intentional about exits. They don't just react to life events by dumping books. They decide, sometimes slowly, sometimes deliberately, that a book has served its purpose in their collection, and it's time to move on. That might mean it appreciated and they want to reallocate. It might mean their interest changed. It might mean they've upgraded their copy. But the common thread is choice, not pressure. And if you can't honestly say you're choosing to sell, then it's usually worth pausing. Now, rule number 2 is about where you sell. And this one is where strategy really comes in, because not all comics belong in the same marketplace. If you're dealing with low-dollar books like smaller keys or modern issues or something like that, a mid-range slab, whatever, platforms like eBay or Instagram consignment pages can work just fine. The audience is broad, liquidity is decent, and fees are manageable relative to the price point. But once you start moving into higher value territory, the strategy changes completely. Now, if you're talking about a book that's in the $25,000 range or higher, you're no longer just selling a comic. You're operating in a serious collector market where buyer trust, authentication, and exposure matter a lot more. And in those cases, it often makes more sense to go through established auction houses like Comic Link, Comic Connect, or Heritage Auctions. The reason is simple. They bring the buyers to you. And at that level, you're not just hoping someone stumbles across your listing. You're putting the book in front of a concentrated pool of serious buyers who already understand the market, already have capital ready, and already trust the platform enough to bid confidently. And that trust premium is real. It often translates into stronger final prices, especially for key books, high grade slabs, and recognizable issues where competition matters. And there's also another subtle advantage. Auctions create urgency, a deadline, a competitive environment. And that competition can push prices higher than what a fixed listing might achieve over time. Now, on the flip side, trying to sell a high end book casually through a low exposure channel can sometimes lead to sitting inventory, endless negotiations, or buyers who aren't actually prepared to transact at that level. And I know you guys know what I'm talking about. They're just not serious buyers. So the rule here is not just to pick a platform, it's match the platform to the value and audience of the book. Lower end, more flexible markets are fine if you want speed and convenience, but higher end books often benefit from structured, competitive environments where serious buyers are already gathered and they know what's coming down the pipeline. They've had time to plan for it. That's why Heritage Auctions releases its books that you can see a month, sometimes 2 months early before they actually go to auction. Now, rule number 3 is where psychology really comes back into play. You need to decide what you actually want for the book before you list it. Not just in terms of a number in your head, but in terms of emotional acceptance. Because one of the most common mistakes sellers make is listing a comic without a clear internal threshold for satisfaction. They put it up for sale, they wait, and then they start reacting emotionally to every offer, every watch, every price movement. And what happens is frustration builds. If it doesn't sell quickly, they assume something is wrong. If it sells below what they kind of hoped for, they feel disappointed. If it sells above what they expected but below the peak they saw once online, they still feel like they left money on the table or something like that. So instead, before you even list it, you should have a number where you can genuinely say, if it sells at this price, I will be happy. Not excited, not disappointed, just okay with it, just satisfied. And that number becomes your anchor. And once you have that anchor, you have to hold it. Because comics are not always fast moving assets outside of auction environments. Even strong books can sit for weeks or months depending on timing, demand cycles, and who happens to be active in the market at that moment. And this is where a lot of sellers make another mistake. They interpret time as rejection. If a book doesn't sell quickly, they assume it's overpriced or unwanted. But in reality, it often just means the right buyer hasn't seen it yet or hasn't decided to act yet. Comic markets are slow by nature outside of major auction events. They don't always behave like stocks or fast moving retail goods. Sometimes patience is part of the process. And if you've already decided your price point is fair and acceptable, then the key is not to panic during that waiting period, because lowering your price emotionally just to make it move is often how regret starts on the selling side of things. It's just not a place you want to go, guys. So when you combine all 3 of these rules together, when you look at what we're really talking about here, the structure becomes pretty clear. First, make sure you actually want to sell the book, not just need to. That's very, very important. All these other rules shouldn't even come into play if you have not cleared that first checkpoint. Second, you need to choose the right marketplace based on the value and audience of the comic. And third, set a price you can emotionally accept, and then allow time for the right buyer to show up and step up and buy it. Selling comics is one of those parts of the hobby that looks simple, but gets complicated the moment emotion enters the equation, and it always does. That's a part of it. We love these comics, we have emotional attachments to them. We wouldn't be buying them and spending the thousands of dollars that we do if we didn't. That's just the reality here. But if you can bring a little structure to it, if you can bring in some guardrails and a little distance from impulse decisions, you'll find that selling becomes a lot less stressful and a lot more intentional. And in a hobby like this, that kind of clarity goes a long, long way. I hope you guys have found this information helpful, and thanks for listening again to the Slabbed Portfolios podcast. I'll see you guys on the next one.